Political news and discussion for your Sunday morning. Politics England here at 10:15 after we join Andrew Marr.
Good morning to you. Now, for many people, in many ways, normal life seems to be back. Eating out, seeing friends and soon going to the gym or swimming pool, but with scientists warning that coronavirus will be swirling back by the winter. And with new restrictions still in place, we know that the world before the pandemic is never coming back quite as it was. One thing, however, is unchanged from last year. This government is just as committed to Brexit as it ever was, and those changes are also coming to Britain by the end of this year. And that means, in effect, new borders. I'm joined live in the studio this morning by the man in charge of that, the Cabinet Minister, Michael Gove. All of this has big consequences for the rest of the British Isles, of course. I'll be talking to the new Taoiseach, Ireland's Prime Minister, Micheal Martin, and from Scotland, where there have been no COVID deaths for some days now, and support for independence is rising, to the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon. Brexit and the huge spending plans from Rishi Sunak this week confronts Labour with big choices. I'll be talking to Rachel Reeves, Michael Gove's opposite number. And on COVID, can it be transmitted by droplets swirling around in the air? The WHO thinks this is possible. So, from the safety of a spacious and well-ventilated studio, I've been talking to the world expert on airborne viral transmission, Professor Wendy Barclay. A busy news morning. Our review comes from The Spectator's Deputy Political Editor, Katy, and the host of BBC Radio 4's Any Questions, our very own Chris Mason. But we begin today with the news and Roger Johnson.
Andrew, thank you. Good morning. The government is to spend more than £700 million on improvements to border controls in preparation for Britain's withdrawal from the EU's single market at the end of the year, when the Brexit transition period ends. New border posts will be built and 500 more staff recruited to help ports to carry out customs checks on goods imported from the European Union. The funding relates only to the border between Great Britain and the EU. A separate package is to be announced for Northern Ireland. President Trump has worn a face covering in public for the first time since the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, despite previously insisting that he would never do so. As infection rates reached record levels this week, Donald Trump seemed to heed the advice of his advisors and experts, and he wore a mask during a visit to a military hospital. America has seen a record-breaking number of new infections in the last 24 hours, with the death toll now standing at nearly 135,000. Thousands of people staged a demonstration in Tel Aviv last night, protesting against economic hardship and what they say is the Israeli government's mishandling of the pandemic. The event was organised by small businesses, self-employed workers and performing artists groups, angered by the government's coronavirus measures. Israel has seen a spike in infections, with nearly 1,500 new cases reported on Friday. Poland's presidential election gets underway this morning in a contest which is likely to shape the country's future and its strained relations with the European Union. The Conservative incumbent, Andrzej Duda, is running against the more socially liberal candidate, Rafał Trzaskowski. More than 100,000 Poles living in the UK voted in the first round of the election 2 weeks ago, according to the Polish Electoral Commission. That's it from me. The next news here on BBC One is at 1 o'clock. Back to you now, Andrew.
Very many thanks for that, Roger. And to the front pages, as we always do. Rishi Sunak's had a very, very big week, and the Sunday Telegraph splashes with his new plans. It says for Brexit, tax cuts to save the economy, and also free ports all around Britain. The government's focus seems to be switching a bit from coronavirus to how to prepare for the end of the trade talks and Brexit, and we'll be talking about that a lot in this programme. But if you're interested in taxes, there's a slightly different story on the front page of The Observer here. This is former Minister Mr Gove suggesting that to pay for the huge cost of the borrowing that Rishi Sunak's brought in, we're going to have tax rises and or spending cuts. So our tax is going up, our tax is going down. Again, something we will talk about a lot. Sunday Times there, Jack Charlton. from Ashington is on almost every single front page. Of course, the great member of the winning England World Cup team and also the manager of Ireland in 1990 when they got into the last 8. We'll talk about him a little bit as well. Their main story is they've been going very, very hard on the Leicestershire clothing manufacturers, what they call the sweatshops. That's been an investigation that's been running for several weeks now in the Sunday Times. Interesting again this morning. Sunday Express they're going for my main guest this morning, Michael Gove's coming in to talk about Britain's new borders. Britain takes back border control, it says. Michael Gove writing also elsewhere in the press. The Sunday Mirror there talking about the terrible Maddie story goes on. And the Mail on Sunday, finally, ministers fear China will blitz UK with a cyber 9/11. We're all aware that relations between the UK and China are deteriorating quite substantially at the moment. That is a story that's going to dominate, I would suspect, for weeks to come. Now, I'm joined, as I said, by Katy Balls of The Spectator and Chris Mason, the owner of the most famous haircut in Britain at the moment, because you had your haircut on live television, Chris.
Yes, that was my attempt to ensure that I got an appointment on the first day, so last Saturday.
Well, it kind of worked.
Yeah, courtesy of the Breakfast Television planning desk, they managed to find me an appointment, so I thought it was only fair I take a camera in tow with me.
Good man. Now, you're starting with the Sunday Express and the border story.
Yeah, so our old friend Brexit has been on a siesta, hasn't it, from the front pages for the last 6 months or so. It is awaking from its slumber. Front page in the Sunday Express, featuring, as you say, Michael Gove, the Cabinet Office Minister, who's going to be in this very chair in half an hour or so. He's written a piece in the Sunday Telegraph, actually, and this is this whole idea about borders, about how our borders are managed after the end of this year. Of course, we're in this transition period, aren't we, where we've legally left the European Union, but in practical terms, everything's stayed the same, regardless of whether a deal is done between the UK and the EU in the next few months. The UK is leaving the customs union, leaving the single market, those hulking economic projects of the EU, and so new arrangements on the border are needed.
And this is the border with France, the sea border, but it's also the border between Great Britain and Northern Ireland as well. That's the controversial, difficult bit.
Yeah, so the focus from Michael Gove this morning is on the GB, the Great Britain border with the EU, i.e. not including Northern Ireland, because, as you say, right at the heart of so many of the rows last year, and no doubt some of the discussions still to come in the next 6 months, is the whole business of how the border is managed between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and then crucially between Northern Ireland and the Republic.
Now, we know that Boris Johnson is getting very tetchy about leaks from the centre of government, and on cue, Liz Truss, the Trade Secretary, has written a letter to Michael Gove and Rishi Sunak complaining or worried about aspects of this new border, and it's been leaked.
Yes, this letter was leaked to Business Insider the other day, sent, as you say, by Liz Truss to the Chancellor and indeed to Mr Gove. And the Mail on Sunday has a fantastic set of quotes this morning, writing up this leak. One Dominic Cummings is clearly not shy about ending up in the newspapers, having found himself all over them.
He's not chastened, is he?
He doesn't appear entirely chastened. I'm not sure that word and him regularly occupy the same sentence. Anyway, it turns out Liz Truss was called into Number 10 for what the Mail on Sunday don't quite call a ticking off. Their language is a little stronger for the exchange without coffee that perhaps went on between Liz Truss and Dominic Cummings. The paper suggesting that Dominic Cummings did buy the idea that Liz Truss hadn't leaked this herself, but perhaps suggested it wasn't a good idea to write it down. Don't write anything down in Whitehall that you don't want to see in public. There's a lovely quote as well here, in which Mr Cummings apparently said to special advisers at their meeting on Friday night that there shouldn't be any leaking because the snakes and reptiles of the media are crawling all over this government. So I don't know if that makes me a snake and you a reptile, or if Katy is an amphibian of some sort.
We're all snakes and reptiles and amphibians. That was a quote originally from Trotsky I read elsewhere, Katy. You've chosen a story from the front of the Sunday Telegraph, which is a change in advice, because we were told not that long ago, if possible, use your car. Now ministers are having second thoughts.
Yes, so the government may want to talk about Brexit, but coronavirus has not gone away. And what we saw on Friday was a shift in the tone from the government on people going back to work. Boris Johnson suggesting that if you can go back to work, you should. But the big problem here is lots of people need public transport to do that. So how do you get that all connected? Now, the suggestion in the Telegraph is conversations are ongoing as to how to do the messaging on this. And I just think it points to that difficult balancing act, which is ultimately they do need people to be able to use public transport, but they don't want to do some big, it's now fine and have, rushes of people trying to go forward. And I mean, we're already hearing other ways they're going to try and make people more comfortable, so face masks being one of them. But ultimately, I think there has been a realisation in recent weeks in government that unless you can get people back to offices, a large parts of the economy are not going to get back to normal. And city centres, we're going to see lots of redundancies. And we've already seen that in those chains that serve office workers. So I think this public transport advice under discussion feeds into that.
And public transport is really difficult because, I took a train to and from Scotland recently, and I was almost the only person on the train. And you think, for how long can they carry on running trains without passengers? And then you pass these buses going up and down, and very few people are sitting on them, and there's big signs at the front saying bus full, with only maybe 6 people inside the bus. How we move from that to a proper public transport system is really difficult.
Yeah, exactly. I think the idea of keeping very regular services at a price most people can afford is really difficult if we keep on this route. So it's actually one of the biggest headaches. And I think it is pretty key to the whole government strategy of getting the economy back. You had a cabinet minister last week say, actually outside of London, lots of people drive. But I think city centres across the UK, you see people depend on that. So it's not something you can just brush off as a London-centric issue.
It's a really big problem. Katy, thank you for that. Chris, I mentioned at the beginning the tax issue. David Gauke on the front page of The Observer saying, actually, people with the broader shoulders, as Labour would put it, are going to have to pay more taxes, and that may well be the truth.
Yeah, lyrical waxing about taxing from David Gauke, who spent 7 years as a Treasury Minister under David Cameron and then under Theresa May. Had a bit of a falling out, didn't he, with Boris Johnson over Brexit, and ended up running against a Conservative candidate in what was his constituency. He's not particularly complimentary about Boris Johnson in an article he's written in The Observer, saying that Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, has outshone the Prime Minister. But yeah, he says in his article, Mr Gauke, that for the first time since the early 60s, the size of government debt is going to exceed the size of the UK economy. Tax increases will have to do most of the heavy lifting, and he says it's not yet clear that the Conservative Party as a whole is reconciled to the reality that sound public finances will require higher taxes. So he's making the case that pretty soon Mr Sunak's going to have to say how we're going to pay for this. And
even if he's not a fan of Boris Johnson himself has also said that we're not going to go back to austerity. The people who suffered after austerity at the bottom of the heap are not going to be made to do that again. And if that's true, then it has to be tax rises.
Yeah, because the kind of colossal borrowing on the never can't carry on forever. Plenty are arguing at Westminster at the moment that it's sustainable for now because interest rates are very low. But at some stage, as you say, it has to be paid back. And if you're not going to cut spending, then tax rises is the obvious solution, I suppose.
All right, Katy, let's turn to the opposition. Again, you've taken an Observer story. Keir Starmer is polling very well, 100 days into his leadership. Just tell us a bit about that.
Yes, so tomorrow marks Keir Starmer's first 100 days, and this poll in the Observer is pretty good news for the Labour leader. It suggests that 50% of the public has had their opinion moved positively in favour of the Labour leader in that time. And on issues like competence, he seems to rank the Prime Minister. We heard a few weeks ago a poll that suggested, quite rare for a Labour leader of late, that he leads on the question of who would make the best Prime Minister, at least in one poll. But I think where you can see a potential problem for Labour, or an opportunity, depending how you look at it, is although this headline say, on all counts, Keir Starmer is ahead, on economic competence, the Tories still lead 42% to 26%. And I think it touches on what Chris is saying to a degree, which is at the moment, the Tories do lead quite strongly on the economy, but lots of difficult decisions, an incredibly unique circumstance in terms of the record borrowing we've had. So if the Chancellor has made some miscalculations, things don't go quite to plan, it could potentially be Keir Starmer's opportunity.
It's quite frustrating for all of us in journalism, but watch and wait and keep your mouth shut for the most part seems to be working quite well for Labour.
Yes, I think lots of people thought Keir Starmer was a bit boring, to be quite frank, in that Labour leadership contest. But actually, I think it was almost a quiet revolution we've seen from Keir Starmer since taking leadership of the party. I don't think he is seen to be the most exciting politician, but there is a sense that actually they just need to make sure he looks competent and then wait for the Tories to make mistakes.
Ridiculously, we're already nearly out of time, Katy, but there's a story you've picked up in The Sun, which is quite fun. There is a conflict or a contradiction between two government policies. Explain more.
Yeah, so this is Rishi Sunak's Eat Out to Help Out scheme, and it's been pointed out that offering potentially half-price Big Macs at the same time we're expecting Downing Street to embark on a Get Fit campaign for the country might not make the most sense on the surface. But I think there's two things worth flagging. They're saying potential tensions, but it's worth noting that the story also says Downing Street is pushing to make this eating out offer targeted at poorer households. And also, I think that the Prime Minister has changed his opinion on health and intervention ever since the own hospital spell. He thinks it's important for tackling coronavirus. But I still think that things like sin taxes, they're not his first port of call. I think he'll look to exercise and the role that health service can play.
Absolutely. The personal is always political. Chris, very, very quickly, Huawei is the other story we haven't talked about.
Yeah.
This is going to be really big, I think, coming forward. A lot of Tories, particularly on the right of the party, feel we need a big reset in our relations with China.
Yeah, so Tim Shipman, the Prince of Political Correspondence, has a piece in the Sunday Times about this, the latest twist. It looks pretty much inevitable now, doesn't it, that the government is going to pull back from Huawei having a role in the 5G network. And Huawei, it would appear in Tim's piece here, suggesting that they're saying, can you put it off until after the next election, and who knows, a more favourable government might come along.
Chris and Katy, thanks both very much indeed. The story of the weather, I sincerely hope, is that it's improving. We've had some really muggy, wet weather. Earlier in the week, it's been brighter and fresher since. Now that we're fully into midsummer, what is coming next? Over to Darren Bett in the weather studio. Darren.
Thank you, Andrew. Good morning. Well, the weather has been improving throughout this weekend. There is some blue sky around. Most of the cloud that we're seeing is quite thin, high cloud like this. There'll be some patchy fair weather cloud, but many places will be dry through the rest of the day, and there'll be some decent spells of sunshine. We'll see more cloud coming into Northern Ireland. Signs of change here. A bit of rain coming in from the west during this afternoon, but temperatures making 19 towards the east coast of Northern Ireland, 20 in eastern parts of Scotland, and probably warmer than that across England and Wales. And it's a warmer day than it was yesterday. But we'll end the day with some sunshine for England and Wales. Further north, though, there's more clouds and rain, not just for Northern Ireland, but pushing into Scotland. Eventually, that'll tumble its way down into northern parts of England and North Wales by the end of the night. And because there's more cloud around tonight, it will be a lot warmer than it's been in the past few nights, around about 11 or 12. Tomorrow looks a little different. There's more cloud for a start. There's patchy rain heading down into England and Wales, mainly affecting western hills. Brighter further north for Scotland and Northern Ireland, but still quite a cloudy airstream, maybe one or two showers. Sunshine in eastern Scotland, though, shouldn't feel too bad. Highest temperatures in the southeast again before we see a bit of rain later on in the day. As far as the week ahead is concerned, no heat wave certainly for this time of the year, and there'll be some sunshine, but generally it's quite cloudy for the week ahead. There won't be very much rain at all. It will be much drier than it's been over the past couple of the weeks. Andrew.
Not bad, slightly disappointing. Now then, Micheal Martin, a former Irish Health and Education Minister, became Taoiseach, or Prime Minister, after Ireland's February general election. It was a three-way race which resulted after big gains by Sinn Féin in a deal between Fianna Fáil and the party of the outgoing Taoiseach Leo Varadkar and Mr Martin's Fianna Fáil. Mr Martin is boss for now, but he has to give way to his rival in December 2022. So how is he going to use the first 2 and a bit years he has in charge? He joins me now live from Dublin. Welcome, Mr Martin. Can I ask you, first of all, whether British people who want to holiday in Ireland this summer are going to be welcome without being quarantined?
Well, first of all, we will be very cautious on international travel generally. And on the 20th of July, we will announce our measures in relation to international travel. And essentially, we have developed a methodology somewhat similar to the European Union and its relationship with third countries. Essentially, the methodology will be in relation to the level of the disease in particular countries, including the UK, and in terms of the the level, and where Ireland will be countries that are at Ireland's level or below. That's the metric, if you like, that will determine our advisory to Irish citizens in terms of their travel arrangements abroad. In terms of people coming into Ireland, the advisory and the quarantining still remains, and it's under constant review. Why? Because there's a lot of international volatility with this virus. We've seen a spike in the numbers. We're very concerned about that, and the Cabinet will be discussing this again this week in terms of measures that we may need to take to strengthen our resources at airports and so on to prevent the spread of this virus. So it's a serious issue for us. We're taking a cautious approach.
Absolutely. But if I was sitting at home in Britain with my computer up, wondering about whether to book that Irish hotel or bed and breakfast or whatever in August, I would probably hold off for the time being. Can I ask you what Britain needs to do to get onto the green list?
Well, I think the suppression of the virus is the key. We've watched reports where in certain parts of the UK there are still difficulties where certain areas have had to go into lockdown and so on, and further severe restrictions. We're all in common facing this issue and this challenge. And that is why we still, as our travel advisory, we're saying to people not to travel for non-essential purposes. That's our advice to our citizens. Because our priority is to get our schools open towards the end of August, to also free up hospital capacity to deal with non-COVID illnesses and to try and get more activity there. So I think it's a very caution is the watchword here, and I think that will be our approach.
And in terms of caution, can I be absolutely clear, it is too early for British people to come to holiday in Ireland without being quarantined.
It is, yeah.
All right, let me turn to the other big subject, of course, of the moment, which is Brexit. Do you now have the information you require on the new arrangements for the Irish border?
We don't yet. I think there has been some progress in terms of a paper that the UK government published, but we do need more detail, we need more precision. I think we need an injection of momentum into the overall talks between the European Union and the United Kingdom in relation to Brexit. I do believe I had a very fruitful discussion with the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, after I took up office. I think we both agreed that it's in everybody's interest, particularly in terms of businesses and giving them certainty and securing employment into the future, that we get a good comprehensive trade deal between the UK and the European Union that can be tariff-free, quota-free, and that would facilitate smooth future relationships and good access to the single market in return for a level playing pitch all round. And I think that's in all of our interest that we get this done. Our concern is time is tight in relation to all of the mechanisms that have to be gone through in terms of getting, the sanction and the approval of the EU member states, the European Union Parliament, and our respective governments. So we are getting into in my opinion, an urgent time frame now.
And given that, do you think it's acceptable for the European Court of Justice not to have jurisdiction over the UK as it goes forward as an independent country? Because that seems to be one of the big sticking points. Would you urge your colleagues to pull back on the ECJ issue?
Well, there are a number of sticking points, not just the ECJ issue. But again, I believe, and I've been in touch with all of the main European negotiators, and indeed, as I say, with the UK Prime Minister, that if there's a will, there's a way in terms of resolving outstanding issues, and mechanisms can be developed to ensure proper stewardship and oversight of any particular agreement. But so far, the progress has been too slow, in my opinion, and we do need an injection of momentum here, and we do need to see a sense that people want to bring these discussions to a conclusion and to have a timeline towards the conclusion of these discussions.
You're clearly You're clearly concerned, you're clearly worried about this, but you've also got an oversight of what's going on from your particular position. In your guts, as it were, do you think we're going to get a deal? Do you think there will be a deal?
I think there will be a deal. There has to be a deal. It can't be at any price. And I think my obligation as Taoiseach of Ireland, and indeed all of our obligation as politicians, is to think of the people of Ireland, the people of the United Kingdom, the people of the European Union. Put politics to one side. People need their jobs. They need to be secure in their jobs. Businesses need certainty. It's absolute, to me, makes absolute sense that the UK should retain access to the European single market for its own benefits. But then with that comes obligations and responsibilities as well, and we all have to work on a level playing field. I see no sense in a no-deal Brexit or in any suboptimal agreement between the UK and the European Union. The ordinary people on the ground, the workers, will suffer if that is the case, and all of us in politics and in public life must do everything we can to protect workers, to protect livelihoods, and protect the essence of our economy.
What does it mean for the Republic of Ireland if the border arrangements aren't ready by the end of the year?
Well, I think the two points I would make about there won't be a border, and that's agreed. The protocol is agreed. The withdrawal agreement is agreed. There can be no resigning back from that. And I think the UK government has signalled that it wants to make this as effective and efficient as possible. That is the working out of the protocol. I think that can be done, and I think Northern Ireland can get the best of both worlds here. Continued access to the UK market, of course, for Northern Ireland businesses and so forth, but also access to the single European market. That's important. And Northern Ireland needs development. It needs economic momentum. And I think let's turn this into an opportunity for Northern Ireland, and through that, the island of Ireland. That's my approach to this. And that's what I want to see maximised out of the series of agreements that will emerge from this. But it's important, obviously, to protect the integrity of the European Union single market as well. We're conscious of that. But we believe within the protocol that's been agreed, within the withdrawal agreement, there's a basis for doing that. Let me turn back to COVID. You mentioned earlier on you're worried about there are more cases in Ireland at the moment, and the R rate is now above 1, I understand, in Ireland. Are you concerned that you may be seeing a second spike later this year, or a second wave? Well, we are concerned that, given what's happening globally, that's always a possibility. And some of our public health officials, many of our public health officials, are particularly concerned about that and the potential of a second wave. And that is why we have set domestic priorities in terms of parts of the economy that we want to reopen, and also clear services like education and indeed health to try and free up capacity there. So we're doing everything we possibly can to avoid a second spike. And clearly the agenda of the government is very much dominated by the continued prevalence of the virus. And we're watching very carefully what's happening across Europe in terms of spikes and in terms of experiences of other member states who've opened up earlier than we have. Now, let me ask you about your relationship. You mentioned Boris Johnson just now. You weren't terribly complimentary about him at the McGill Summer School about this time last year. You said anyone in Dublin who met Mr Johnson during his time as Foreign Secretary will tell you the many ways in which he failed to show the slightest level of understanding about the operations of the Good Friday Agreement. I don't think anyone can credibly say he has thought through how to promote prosperity and reconciliation in Northern Ireland. Have you had second thoughts about him? Well, I was very heartened by our discussion in terms of trying to reset the British-Irish relationship post-Brexit, which I think the Prime Minister is very keen on doing. And I was particularly taken by that, and we both committed to the necessity of doing that in a post-Brexit scenario, because from the Irish perspective, the entire peace process on the island of Ireland was based on the relationship between Britain and Ireland, and then the relationship north-south, and then within the two traditions within Northern Ireland. So central to all of this is a very strong, proactive relationship between Britain and Ireland and our two governments. And I'm very dedicated and committed to nurturing that and ensuring that we can improve upon it, and so is the Prime Minister. And that's the basis upon which I intend to take our relationship into the future. Your party is committed to a united Ireland, but you are not an enthusiast for the Sinn Féin policy of a new referendum, or so-called border poll. If that's not going to be the way forward, what is the way forward? The way forward is to continue to nurture the various sets of relationships that I spoke about earlier, and also to work out how we can share the island of Ireland together in peace and harmony into the future, respecting each other's traditions and concerns. And there's a lot of work to do in relation to that, and that is why in my own office we're setting up a new shared island unit to develop fresh thinking around that. I want to inject greater momentum into the north-south dimension of the Good Friday Agreement in terms of practical, pragmatic, economic projects and activity that we can get underway. And I think, to me, a border poll is far too divisive at this stage,
Right.
and doesn't deal with the more fundamental issue of how we continue to live and work together as we evolve and live on this island, particularly in a post-Brexit scenario.
Sure. Micheal Martin, I can't end this interview without asking you about Jack Charlton, a really big figure in English football, but a titanic figure in the story of Irish football too. Anyone of a certain age can remember 1990 and all of that. Just tell us a little bit about how he is regarded now in Ireland.
He is regarded as a hero in Ireland, a person for whom we have the greatest of affection. And I just want to let his family know, as I said yesterday, that in the hearts of every Irish person, there's a special place for Jack Charlton. And it's about more than just football. Those heady days of the late 1980s and 1990 in Ireland were quite extraordinary. It was as if Jack Charlton and the entire Irish team took us out of a bleak and miserable 80s into a very exciting 1990s. And the Italia World Cup campaign was the catalyst for that. My wife and I got married in 1990. Our honeymoon was in the middle of those great series of games, and the Packie Bonner penalty save and David O'Leary putting it in and Scalacci eventually killing our hopes and dreams. But Jack Charlton just, I think, personified the essence of sport. And I listened to the players yesterday. That sense of joy that emanated from their conversations about playing football for joy. And the whole country was joyful. And
Micheal
nowadays
Martin.
in sport, it tends to be too intense. But Charlton's era was about the sheer youthful, childish enjoyment of the wonderful game.
Micheal Martin, what an epitaph. Thanks very much indeed for talking to us today. Much appreciated. Thank you for that. Now then, a high-spending Tory government poses obvious questions, as we were just saying, for the Labour opposition about the distinctiveness of its policies on taxation and indeed spending. Under Keir Starmer, Labour's also positioned itself as a critical friend over the pandemic and has taken a watch-and-wait attitude to the Brexit negotiations. Rachel Reeves, the shadow cabinet member who leads on Brexit, is with me now. Rachel Reeves, welcome. Can I start with a very straightforward good morning, yes or no question? Are you in favour of compulsory face masks in England when we're shopping?
Yes, I think that would be a sensible way forward. I think people are increasingly wearing them, but some greater clarity from government about that, I think, would be helpful. People want to do the right thing, but they want to know what the right thing is. And so we already have it on public transport. I think it would inspire greater confidence and might encourage more people to go out and spend money if they see more people wearing face masks in shops.
Now, as a party, you have been quietly supportive of a lot of what the government said about Brexit recently. Michael Gove is now announcing a new border with all the spending, the extra jobs, the extra infrastructure. Do you welcome that?
I think it's too little, too late. It's only just over 5 months now until the end of the transition period. The government have had 4 years now to put in place the procedures that we need to ensure the free flow of goods and services across that border. We left the European Union in January this year. The transition period comes to an end at the end of this year. We saw an extraordinary letter from the Cabinet Minister Liz Truss to the Chancellor and to Michael Gove this week, setting out a whole range of concerns that we've also just heard in your previous interview about a lack of preparation on the Northern Ireland border, about potentially being in breach of World Trade Organization rules, the risks of smuggling, and all of those concerns expressed by a senior cabinet minister with less than 6 months until the end of the transition period. So I look forward to hearing what Michael Gove has got to say. But so far we've heard from the government that there's going to be a lorry park, a 27-hectare lorry park 20 miles from the border in Dover. Well, look, I think we're all in favour of infrastructure investment, but I thought that was going to mean hospitals, railways and new schools around the country, not investment in a lorry park in Kent. And so I would like to know from Michael Gove how much this is going to cost, the number of additional customs officials to implement this bureaucracy, but also, most crucially, the cost to British businesses, because the Labour Party want to see British business thrive, create jobs and export. We don't want to see exports stuck at a lorry park in southern England.
The Labour Party is also very clear that you want to see a trade deal, if at all possible. Now, it's clear that this is getting very, very difficult. in the interests of keeping Britain completely independent after Brexit, do you support the government in being absolutely and resolutely opposed to any involvement of the European Court of Justice after this is over?
Well, look, I think the public are pretty astounded that after the promises we heard from the government at the general election last year that there was an oven-ready deal, they stood down the Yellowhammer preparations for no deal, that here we are on the 12th of July without any progress in the talks. I'm very happy that that the government are continuing the negotiations. I think that it is right to say the European Court of Justice shouldn't be able to oversee, but there must be compromise on both sides, from the European Union and from the UK government. We were promised an oven-ready deal. It looks like the government's forgot to switch the oven on, and here we are with just over 5 months to go, with no clarity for businesses about how to prepare. And businesses have had a torrid time these last few months. They're looking for certainty from the government, and we're sadly lacking that still today.
So you basically back the government on the ECJ issue, opening that oven door one more time. It's clear post-COVID how important the state aid rules are going to be in getting the British economy going again. Again, I ask you, if the EU insists on their own state aid rules and not the freedoms that we're going to get after this, would you back the government on that too?
I think the government have hid behind EU state aid rules on too many occasions as an excuse not to support British industry. I don't think it is the European Union that has stopped the British government supporting British businesses over the last 10 years. I think it is their ideological opposition to supporting British industry. So I have no truck with the government hiding behind those rules as a reason to fail to support British businesses. And, you know, we've seen it again in the financial statement from the Chancellor this week, where businesses from aviation and aerospace to automotives to the beauty sector have been calling out and demanding support from government, and very little was forthcoming this week. So the government can't hide behind EU rules. It's their own choices of whether they want to support British industry, and I'm afraid this government have been found wanting.
Of the specific measures made in that announcement from Rishi Sunak this week, all the different measures to support jobs and so on, are there any that you actually oppose?
There's one that I would very much oppose, and that is the reduction in stamp duty for the purchases of second homes and buy-to-let properties. That could cost £1 billion based on assumptions about the purchases of those homes last year. Last year, a third of homes purchased were purchased as either second homes or as buy-to-let properties by private landlords. I don't think it is right to give those people tax cuts.
Right.
When we are spending taxpayers' money, it's really important that we target that at the industries that are frankly on their knees, and at workers who have lost their jobs or in fear of losing their jobs, and not to give a tax break to those people who can afford second homes or buy-to-let properties.
So this is really about whose shoulders bear the main burden of paying for all the costs of the COVID crisis in the long term. The Shadow Chancellor has said, your colleague Annalise Dodds has said, that she's not in favour of tax rises. Is that really the Labour Party's position, that after all this time, as the party which wants higher taxes on those with the broadest shoulders, the better off, you're coming away from that?
We're in a situation right now where the entire focus of government should be on protecting jobs and creating new jobs. The focus has got to be on jobs, 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 and getting our economy growing. And that is the right thing to do by British businesses that are on their knees, by workers who are desperate for some hope for the future. But also, that's the best way to get our public finances back on track as well. Because if people are in work, it means they're spending money in their local communities, in shops and bars and restaurants and cafes. It means that they are paying taxes and contributing to the public finances. And so that's why we say that the priority right now should be on jobs and getting our economy moving. This is not the right time to be putting up taxes. This is the time to be focusing all of government's efforts to getting the economy growing and creating those jobs. And that will help address the dire situation with the public finances as well.
But before long, as a country, we are going to have to pay for all of this. If Rishi Sunak came to the Labour Party now and said, look, I'm afraid that everybody earning over, say, £80,000 a year has to pay more tax to get the public finances back in support, would you say, no, we're against those tax rises?
Well, we would look at any proposals that the government have put forward, and under Keir Starmer's leadership and with Annalisa Dodds as our Shadow Chancellor, we have tried to be a constructive opposition, to support the government when they get things right, but to push them further, including on jobs and support with the flexible furlough scheme that we want to see, when we think the government needs to do more. But right now, we think the entire focus of government and the Treasury should be to get people back into work.
Sorry to jump in again, but asking people earning over £80,000 a year to pay more tax was a Labour policy. Have you really moved away from those kind of policies? Labour is no longer the party of fair taxes, of taxing people with the broadest shoulders most. Is that really the position?
Well, we're not setting out proposals at the moment for the next manifesto. The next general election is likely to be 4 years away. We had a terrible defeat in the election last year. We need to reassess a whole range of policies, and I'm not going to write our manifesto on an ad hoc basis on this programme, Andrew. There's plenty of time to do that work, but right now the focus has got to be on jobs, as Keir Starmer and Annalisa Dodds have said out very clearly this week.
One very quick, different question. Is it really true that Labour is boycotting Facebook? And if it is, why?
Well, all MPs and the Labour Party use Facebook to get across our message, but what we're not doing at the moment is advertising on Facebook. And that is in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter campaign, but also in line with what many businesses are doing this month, which is to express our concerns about the failure of Facebook to take down some hateful material from their platforms, and to take more responsibility for the lies and the propaganda that are sometimes put out there on Facebook. And Facebook need to do more to take responsibility. And this is just one way that businesses and the Labour Party and others can put pressure on Facebook to do the right thing and to take a tougher action on hate crime and hate speech.
Some good, clear answers. Rachel Reeves, thank you very much indeed for talking to us this morning. Now then, Scotland's approach to COVID-19 has been a bit tougher than England's. Compulsory face masks in shops first and a slightly slower unlocking. No deaths at all from the disease in Scotland in the last few days, as the Minister Nicola Sturgeon's elimination strategy continues. But it hasn't been without controversy about quarantining Scots who've been on holiday in, for instance, Spain, and a poor record in care homes. Now, Nicola Sturgeon joins me from Glasgow. Nicola Sturgeon, welcome. You have said that the rate of infections of coronavirus in England is now 5 times worse than Scotland, where you're pursuing an elimination strategy. And yet you're not yet pressing the button on making people from England coming into Scotland quarantine. Why not?
I've said we will keep all of these things under review. I set out in Parliament just on Thursday that our biggest risk, or certainly one of our biggest risks over the next few weeks, as we have driven levels of the virus to very low levels in Scotland, is the risk of importation into the country. Now, that's why we've taken a very cautious decision about international quarantine, and this is not a position I relish being in. It also means that we have to take a very close look at making sure that we are not seeing the virus come in from other parts of the UK. That's not political, it's not constitutional, it's just taking a similar view to countries across the world in terms of protecting populations from the risk of the virus. So it's not something we have decided to do at this stage. It's not something I'm immediately planning to do, but I will take decisions the best I can to protect the health of Scotland, and to take that absolutely from a public health perspective.
So what are you looking at in a public health perspective? Are you waiting to see if there is a further increase in infection levels in England? And if that is the case, and you decide to ask people from England coming into Scotland to quarantine, how do you do that practically?
Well, look, don't focus all of this discussion on quarantine. One of the things that I think we must do in the immediate term, and I took part in a meeting, a telephone meeting with Michael Gove and the other First Ministers, I think earlier last week, and we need to work together on outbreak management. So we recently had a cross-border outbreak. We think it started in Carlisle, but spread into Dumfries and Galloway. So we worked together to make sure the right restrictions were in place. So fundamentally, this is about where there are outbreaks, as there is in Leicester right now, the right outbreak management being put in place, and that then mitigates against having to put any border restrictions in place. So we need to look at these things very carefully, and we need to be driven entirely by public health considerations.
We saw some of your more enthusiastic supporters recently trying to stop cars at the border and turn them back. That's the kind of thing, from your tone, that you absolutely don't want to happen again.
Absolutely not. This is not about saying to people in England they're not welcome in Scotland. Of course, people in England are welcome in Scotland. Lots of people from England live in Scotland and vice versa. This is not about politics. It's not about a constitutional agenda. It's just about taking decisions that try to protect people in Scotland as much as possible from COVID, just as the UK government, I'm sure, wants to do everything it can to protect the population in England. If you look at the situation in Australia right now, you can't travel from Melbourne to Sydney because of the spike in cases in Melbourne. The Governor of New York has restricted travel from some of the worst affected states in America into New York. Leaders across the world are taking these very objective, public health driven decisions, and I'm determined to do likewise.
And you've just made the case very strongly there for quarantining people from England coming into Scotland. What would need to change? Because, you know, one of your own advisors, Professor Devi Sridhar from Edinburgh University, has said that many people cross the border every day. I think we will probably never get to full elimination of coronavirus without England's cooperation.
Well, I'd like to see the UK government be more explicit that it was trying to get to levels of coronavirus that was virtually elimination levels, but that's decisions for the Prime Minister and the UK government to take. These are not decisions I will take lightly, but they're equally not decisions I will shy away from. We need to be sure that any outbreaks in England are being properly managed, just as England will want to be sure that any outbreaks in Scotland are being properly managed. It's when there isn't that confidence that the concern about possible importation would grow. So we're looking very carefully at cases in Scotland. We had an increase in cases on Friday, which then reduced again yesterday. So we're looking literally case by case right now to make sure we're doing everything necessary. There is a concern. I mean, I noted the number of deaths in the UK yesterday was 148. I think 147 of those were in England alone. So, you know, we look at all of this very carefully, and I will continue to take whatever decisions I and my colleagues in the Scottish Government judge are necessary to keep the levels of this virus as low as possible. But we have the most significant easing of lockdown in Scotland ahead of us this week. So the fundamental primary responsibility to keep the virus low in Scotland is on the shoulders of all of us in Scotland to do the right things about face coverings and avoiding crowded places, cleaning our hands, keeping 2 metres distance and following the advice to self-isolate and get tested if we have symptoms.
And Nicola Sturgeon, I mentioned Edinburgh University a moment ago. They also did a study which suggested that had Scotland introduced a lockdown just a week earlier, 2,000 lives could have been saved. With hindsight, I know it's a wonderful thing and all that, but with hindsight, do you think it was a mistake not to lock down earlier, knowing what you know now?
Look, I don't know that for sure, because we're focused on managing this crisis day by day, trying to learn as we go. I've been pretty open and upfront all along. Mistakes will have been made. Some of those will have been simple, straightforward mistakes. Others will be about applying knowledge we have now to decisions that were taken then when we didn't have that knowledge. In the fullness of time, we will look back and very critically assess all of the decisions that were taken. That will undoubtedly include the timing of lockdown. Scotland went into lockdown at the same time as the rest of the UK, but arguably that was at an earlier stage in the pandemic curve in Scotland. But we will also want to look at decisions that were taken around quarantining of international travel back then. I'm absolutely clear in my own mind that there must be a full analysis of all of that for accountability, but also so that we learn lessons for the future.
And in that same spirit, may I ask you about care homes in Scotland? Overall, the story in Scotland has been relatively positive compared to other places. But in care homes, you had a particular problem, and you were still discharging people a week or 6 days after they had stopped in England without testing. I think 1,300 people were discharged into Scottish care homes from Scottish hospitals in March and April, and mandatory testing wasn't introduced until the end, well, the 21st of April, towards the end of April. Now, you've said that you have some doubts about that looking back. Can you actually apologise for that policy and admit, frankly, now that that was a mistake?
I regret and apologise for every death from this. I don't think it is appropriate for any politician to be defensive about this. But what I absolutely refute is that there was some particular problem in Scotland or that we didn't take great care. So from the issue of discharge from hospital into care homes, that was following a policy of clinical risk assessment and strict guidance in place in care homes. The situation in care homes, not just in Scotland, but across the UK and the world, has been awful, and I will be the first person to concede that. But what I absolutely do not accept is that we have a particular problem. If you look at excess deaths, and I discussed this with you the last time I was on the programme, if you look at excess deaths overall in care homes, they are lower in Scotland than in England, but we ascribe more of them to COVID. So I think more than 70% of excess deaths in care homes in Scotland have been attributed to COVID, where the figure is around 50% in England, which raises the question, what are those excess deaths in England attributable to, if not COVID? So we are recording these, I think, more rigorously rather than having more care home deaths, as some people have been suggesting.
I see. Let me turn to the other big announcement of the week, which was Rishi Sunak's announcement on the economic response to COVID. And in the course of that, I'm sure you heard him say, no nationalist can ignore the undeniable truth. This help has only been possible because we are a United Kingdom. And he was talking about a total of £4.6 billion, which has gone to Scotland to help with COVID. He was right about that, wasn't he?
No, and fundamentally I don't think he's right to be making sort of overtly political points about this. I've tried throughout this not to do that, because I think what we're dealing with right now is too important for that. But it's a nonsense argument. I mean, look across the world, from the Republic of Ireland, I heard your interview with the Taoiseach earlier on, to smaller countries all over who have, in some respects, actually had bigger fiscal stimulus than the UK. The issue here right now is that he holds the borrowing powers, because remember, this is borrowed money, and the people of Scotland will play their part in repaying that borrowing, just as people elsewhere in the UK. It's a limitation on the powers right now of the Scottish Government that mean we have to rely on the Treasury. And if he wants to give more flexibility, which we've been asking for the Scottish Government around borrowing in particular, then we can do more even than we are doing right now as the Scottish Government. But these kind of nonsense points, frankly, I think are a bit regrettable and ridiculous, particularly given the severity of what we face.
We're in this very, very strange situation now, Nicola Sturgeon, where I am going to mention the fact that enthusiasm for independence, according to the polls, is now rising in Scotland, and there is a clear majority for independence, and you don't talk about it. While this coronavirus epidemic goes on, are you simply going to hit the pause button on all constitutional arguments and all constitutional developments?
Look, at the moment I'm focused 100% on tackling COVID, and people can agree with that or not agree with it, but until we're out of this crisis, that is going to continue to be the case. I think everybody knows I want Scotland to be independent, but maybe the scenario that you've just outlined there has a lesson in it for my own party. You know, at no point during this have I weighed my decisions on a political basis or on a constitutional basis, but as you say, at a time when I and the SNP have not been talking about independence all the time, but getting on with the job of autonomous decision making and trying to take the right decisions to get the country through a crisis, support for independence appears to have increased. So maybe there's a bit of a lesson in there about show, not tell. So who knows?
So it does sound as if no more talk about the next referendum, maybe for the rest of this year at least.
Look, as long as I need to be focusing on the coronavirus crisis and the economic legacy of that crisis, that is going to have my 100% focus. I haven't changed my view on independence. I think Scotland would be much better off as an independent country. I want to see Scotland become an independent country. None of that has changed, but I think the people across Scotland right now would expect me to have my entire focus on leading the country through the biggest crisis that any of us have ever experienced, and that's what I'm going to continue to do. And if in the process of doing that it's not my intention, then people can see the benefits of autonomous decision making, then as I say, perhaps there is a lesson there.
Very interesting. Nicola Sturgeon, good to talk as ever. Thanks very much indeed. Now then, airborne transmission of coronavirus doesn't just mean somebody spluttering next to you on the bus. It's about how tiny droplets of virus can stay in the air for quite a while. And that's a prospect which raises obvious worries about daily life. The World Health Organization this week says it's got concerns. Professor Wendy Barclay is chair of the Influenza Virology Department at Imperial College London, and she's a world expert on the airborne transmission of respiratory viruses and a member of the government SAGE committee. When I spoke to her just a little earlier, I began by asking why airborne transmission was such a worry.
Yeah, so what we know is that viruses can be expelled into the air from infected people in very small droplets, and sometimes even in droplets that are so small we call them aerosols. And these aerosols can remain suspended in the air and can travel some distance away from the person who's breathed them out. And we do know that SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID, can remain viable, remain infectious in these very small droplets. So that raises the possibility and indeed the likelihood that COVID can be transmitted through these small particles that can travel through the air.
Do we have any idea about how long these particles remain dangerous?
Yeah, so laboratory studies where the virus has been sort of purposefully put into the air tell us that the virus can remain there for more than an hour in its infectious form.
Now, this week, the World Health Organization said that airborne transmission can't be ruled out in some cases. Was that an important change of emphasis from them?
Yes, it is the first time that the World Health Organization have sort of acknowledged that the airborne route contributes to the spread of this disease. Of course, there are other routes as well that we have to keep bearing in mind, the close contact routes, directly touching someone or touching a contaminated surface. So, you know, washing our hands is still very important. But what this new acknowledgement means is that the route through the air probably also contributes in some circumstances.
So, good ventilation, absolutely essential. Now, we do know that there was a restaurant in Guangzhou in China where there was transmission through the air system. So what about air conditioning in all of this?
Some air conditioners simply push the air around inside a room. And so that's not really ventilation. That doesn't dilute the virus out anymore. And indeed, the restaurant situation was very interesting because the people who acquired their infection was sort of downstream of the airflow that the air conditioner was producing. So in those conditions, air conditioners aren't really helpful. They're just sort of channeling the virus in one particular direction. But there are other ways of handling the air where the air gets sort of replenished and exchanged.
So this was also a week which, with the beginning of the unlocking, lots of people are thinking about going back to, I don't know, choir practices or gyms or exercise classes. Are there some things, thinking about the airborne transmission of COVID, that we should be avoiding?
There have been a number of outbreaks associated with choirs, for example, and it's quite possible that we generate more of these small droplets when we talk loudly or sing, or perhaps when we're exercising. So in those circumstances, you definitely would want to be in a well-ventilated room, and perhaps also the social distancing that we've all become used to is useful.
So there's been a lot of discussion this week about masks and face coverings. Now, as a scientist who specialises in airborne transmission of virus, what's your view? Are they actually useful?
The use of face masks is really about protecting other people from you in case you're infected. We do think that this virus is breathed out in droplets. Whether or not those droplets are large or small, it's quite likely that a face mask will remove some of them from your breath. And so if you are infected by the virus, but perhaps not yet ill, but you are at a point where you've got virus in your breath, then you may be hazardous to other people.
You spoke a moment ago about people who don't feel ill, nevertheless passing on the disease, what's called asymptomatic transmission. As a scientist, when did you first know that asymptomatic transmission of COVID-19 could be a problem?
We've all been conscious that respiratory viruses can transmit from asymptomatic people, but it's very difficult to know at the outset of an outbreak what proportion of events like that will happen for any particular virus. It can be quite different. And of course, back in January and February, this was a coronavirus, little studied group of viruses. And the best information that we really had to go on was the previous coronavirus known as SARS-CoV or SARS-CoV-1. And there, the proportion of asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic transmission was very, very low, if not negligible. Right. So most of the early thinking was around what experience we had with other coronaviruses, particularly SARS-CoV. Of course, as we've moved through the outbreak and the pandemic, new data has come to light, and it now is obvious to many of us that you can get some pre-symptomatic and probably asymptomatic transmission going on.
Professor, thanks very much for talking to us this morning. Very interesting indeed. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Now, my last but not least guest this morning is the Minister for the Cabinet Office, Michael Gove. Mr. Gove, welcome.
Morning.
Should face masks be mandatory in shops in England?
I don't think mandatory, no, but I would encourage people to wear face masks when they're inside, in an environment where they're likely to be mixing with others and where the ventilation may not be as good as it might. So I think that it is basic good manners, courtesy, consideration to wear a face mask if you are, for example, in a shop.
But we don't need a law to do that.
Well, I trust people's good sense. Now, of course, the government at all times, does look at the emerging evidence about what the best way to control the disease is. If necessary, then, and if tough measures are required, as we've seen in Leicester, obviously a very different situation, then tough measures will be taken. But on the whole, my view is that it's always better to trust people's common sense, to give them a clear sense of what is wise, and I think that individuals and businesses are responding well to that lead.
You're talking about borders today. Are Britain's borders going to be ready and secure by the end of this year?
Yes, I think they will be.
Because your colleague Liz Truss, as you know, has expressed some real worries about this. She said in her letter that she wanted assurances that we'll be able to deliver full control at ports by July 2021, and that plans are in place from January to mitigate the risk of goods being circumvented from ports implementing full controls. In other words, the whole thing is tight by then, and you can give that assurance.
Yes, absolutely. Everyone in government wants to make sure that our departure from the European Union is a success. And whether or not we secure a Canada-style trade deal with the EU during the course of the negotiations that we're carrying out, we know, outside both the single market and the customs union, come what may. And that means that business needs to take some steps, and government certainly needs to take some steps in order to make sure we're ready. That's the basis of the announcement today, more than £700 million in order to provide infrastructure at ports, to invest in technology, and also to make sure that we have the personnel to keep ourselves safe.
And are you sure that we will be complying with international law by the 1st of January? Because again, Liz Truss was worried about that.
Yes, I'm absolutely certain that everything that we do is compliant with the law, indeed is designed to ensure that we can not just comply with law, but keep people safe, but also facilitate trade as well. Because the critical thing about our new border infrastructure is that it's there both to allow us to trade with Europe, but also to make it easier to trade with the rest of the world with new trade deals that Liz is leading on. And also, it's part of the process of making sure our points-based immigration system can come into.
So explain to us, why is Michael so confident and Liz so worried? And are you going to sack her for leaking?
No. Liz is one of my best friends in the cabinet. We work together because we've got a shared interest in making sure that Brexit works, that we have trade deals that help UK customers get cheaper goods and help UK producers access new markets and make sure that we can protect jobs in this country. Yes. And it's part of the natural process of government that a minister from one department will test the propositions of a minister from another department. And one of the things that we do, I worked with Liz, we were ministers together at the Department for Education, is that we will discuss what we think the best approach is and then get cracking on implementation.
So you say get cracking. Now, we don't know who leaked this letter, I should make clear. But when it comes to the border policy, it was your time. I mean, you set the time scale all the way through. Why have you left it so late? A lot of people are worried that you have left it a bit late.
I don't think so. And I heard Rachel Reeves earlier make that point. But with respect to Rachel, who's a great person, the Labour Party until recently was saying that we should have a second referendum. And they were saying that while I was in the Cabinet Office last autumn, laying the ground for preparation for Brexit come what may. So I think some of the criticism has come. How can I put this? There's an element of Captain Hindsight about some of this, but what we've been doing is laying the groundwork for months now, and we've been consulting with the people who are responsible for freight, for our borders, and all the rest of it. And it's a timetable that we've developed in cooperation with them.
Is it true that you're buying a large property in Kent as a lorry park? Can you explain what that's for and if it's where it's going to be and all of that?
We've been exploring a variety of potential sites. And no, it's not the intention to do that. What we want to do is to make sure that freight travelling through Kent can get to Dover and then onto the ferries and then into France and into the rest of Europe as smoothly as possible. Precisely. And so it may be the case that, not so much in Kent but elsewhere, that there will be specific pieces of infrastructure that we put in place in order to smooth the flow of traffic. There's been some speculation about one particular site. We are looking at how we can develop infrastructure which makes sure that we avoid what I think all of us want to see avoided, which is any sense of the routes being clogged. And we're working with the haulage industry and freight forwarders in order to do that. But it's not the intention to create a massive concrete lorry park. It is the intention to provide the smart infrastructure, which in Kent and elsewhere will allow trade to flow.
This is a complicated matter. The Taoiseach I was talking to earlier on said that he did not yet have the information. He was rather worried about the slow information coming on the matter of the Irish border.
Yep.
Is he going to have everything he needs by the end of the year?
Yes. The announcement today is about the GB border with the EU, making sure, as I say, that we can have a good trading relationship with the EU and the rest of the world. We'll be seeing more about the specific situation in Northern Ireland later this month, but we'll be building on the command paper that we published earlier this year, which lays out the way in which we can ensure that there's no need for customs infrastructure on the island of Ireland. And what we are doing is making sure that people in Northern Ireland can continue to have unfettered access to the whole of the UK.
But some of your colleagues, as you know, are rather worried about aspects of this. This is the Liz Truss letter again. The digital delivery of the dual tariff system, that's the EU tariffs in Northern Ireland, is at high risk. And HMRC are planning to apply the EU tariff as a default to all imports in Northern Ireland on the 1st of January 2021. Now, she's worried about this. Lots of your colleagues, as you know, are also worried about this. Is that true? Is that the default position?
Well, we'll be saying more about how we're going to implement the Northern Ireland Protocol later this month. And I don't want to preempt that announcement, but we'll also be explaining the additional investment that will be going into HMRC, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs processes, in order to facilitate trade. Now, of course, we want to make sure that we get a trade deal with the European Union, which doesn't impose tariffs or quotas, but as we've outlined in our command paper, it won't be the case that we'll be levying tariffs on goods that stay in Northern Ireland.
I understand there'll be no tariffs, but there are going to be some kind of checks and some kind of regulations.
Yeah, there are some specific checks that will occur for products of animal origin. Sorry to be so technical, but in essence, we've known that the island of Ireland, since Victorian times, has been a single epidemiological zone, so that vets know that you treat the island of Ireland differently for some rules than GB. It
and
used to be the case.
Food products similarly.
Yeah, this is the distinction. I remember when BSE was a problem. The fact that Ireland was treated differently was something that the Reverend Dean Paisley was very pleased by. He said, "My voters are Irish, my voters are British, but my cows are Irish." Now, in respect of the Northern Ireland Protocol, there will be some checks for products of animal origin that go from GB to Northern Ireland, but we want them to be as light touch and minimal as possible.
So let's just clear up one thing for sure, which is what Boris Johnson said in December. He said there's no question of there being checks on goods going from Northern Ireland to Great Britain or from Great Britain to Northern Ireland. Let's be honest and straightforward. That is not quite true, is it?
Well, as we've explained, there is unfettered access for goods from Northern Ireland into Britain, no problem there at all. For commercial goods and so on, as they're going into Northern Ireland, one or two rather simple processes.
So when the Prime Minister said no checks, was he correct or was he not correct?
Well, I think the thing is that it's certainly not going to be the case that you will have customs officers saying, halt and so on. What you will have are vets who will be suitably equipped in order to carry out surveillance. And as I say, in most cases, because we will have the same standards on both sides of the Irish Sea, there won't be any impediment to trade.
Well, however they're dressed up and whatever the details are, you just told me there will be checks. The Prime Minister said clearly there would be no checks, which is true.
Well, there is, without wanting to be overly semantic.
Be as semantic as you like.
The Prime Minister was talking about
checks or no checks.
The Prime Minister was talking in the context of the sorts of customs checks that we might see, for example, in Calais, and he was saying that you won't have them here. There's a difference, and it was the Prime Minister himself who, in concluding the withdrawal agreement, made the point that I've made about Ireland being a single epidemiological zone and saying that Ireland could have different SPS criteria from the rest of the UK. So at the time the Prime Minister was making that point, he had already drawn that distinction. So it's always possible to, when politicians are seeking...
It's always possible to read you a very, very clear sentence.
Yes,
There's no question of there being checks on goods going from Northern Ireland to Great Britain or from Great Britain to Northern Ireland. I just put it to you, that is not so.
Well, you have to look at the context in which the Prime Minister was speaking, and he was speaking after he himself had said that we should have Ireland treated differently for SPS reasons. So he was talking about the customs context, not the SPS context.
We've heard from people around Michel Barnier that there are moves on EU's side in these negotiations.
Yeah.
Are you confident, as the Prime Minister said that we were going to do, that we will get a trade deal this month?
Well, I don't know about this month, but it's certainly the case that progress is being made. Yes, there are divisions between ourselves and the EU, but to take a case in point, until recently, the European Union was saying that there had to be a permanent presence in Northern Ireland. They needed to have an agency there to supervise it. They've now retreated on that. We persuaded them that wasn't necessary.
There is movement, presumably on both sides.
There is movement, and to be fair to Michel Barnier and his team, they recognise the strength of the case that our negotiators are putting. But there are still differences. So there are hopeful signs, but I wouldn't want to be over, what's the word?
Enthusiastic, positive, upbeat.
Over-enthusiastic.
Yes.
I want to be optimistic, but not over-enthusiastic.
Okay. Let me ask you about something else. You've been a long-time enthusiast for civil service reform.
Yes.
We've talked about it forever. Are we finally going to see chunks of the civil service moved out of the centre of London and into other parts of England?
Yes.
Are we going to see the House of Lords move to York?
I don't know.
But possibly.
Well, that's a matter for Parliament. It's not.
Okay. Well, tell us the case for doing that. It's a lovely place, York, but tell us the case for moving a chunk of the legislature out of London after all these centuries and putting it back in York.
Well, I'll tell you what my own views on two areas. Firstly, on civil service reform, I think it's vitally important that decision makers are close to people. I think it's vitally important that the strength of the UK government is displayed across the whole of the United Kingdom and that we distribute opportunity, jobs and investment fairly. We've already got civil servants in Scotland who are working for the Department for International Development and Wales who are working for the Department for Transport. We can do more. It's good for the union. It's good for equal opportunity. It is good for what's been called levelling up. As far as the legislature goes, that is obviously a question for the House of Commons and the House of Lords. Government has to tread carefully, canny there. But my own view, I think it would be a good thing if people were to see Parliament closer to different parts of the United Kingdom. And I don't see there's any reason why we can't have more operations of the UK Parliament in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. It's, our UK Parliament is a parliament for everyone in the United Kingdom. So making it more accessible, and we can discuss how, is a good thing.
But without tying you down to what the Commons and the Lords might decide in the future, in your instinct, this is going to happen.
No, I don't know about that. I don't know about York specifically. I don't know about the House of Lords specifically. Yeah. But my own view is we should bring Parliament closer to the people. I think a distinction's drawn up in some people's minds where they think that the UK Parliament is for England, Holyrood is for Scotland. There are two parliaments for the people of Scotland, and we work together. And Nicola Sturgeon pointed out earlier that we've had good conversations about how to collaborate on working to deal with the coronavirus. I want people to be as aware of the good work that the UK government does in Scotland as they are aware of the work that Holyrood does.
In your own personal view, should Huawei stay inside the 5G network in this country?
Well, it doesn't matter what my personal view is. This is going to be decided by the National Security Council. And when the National Security Council decides, then that decision will be communicated to Parliament and to others. I'm in some respects rather old-fashioned. I think that if you've got something like a National Security Council, then the decisions that are taken there shouldn't be preempted by individual ministers riding hobby horses.
We both know that relations between the UK and China are deteriorating at the moment. They're not good. And there have been reports today that the government is worried about a cyber attack on this country, as has happened in Australia, as a result of that. Are you one of those people worried about that?
Well, again, I don't want to seem even more crusty, but I don't think it's a good idea for ministers to talk about cybersecurity issues in that way. The UK has a relationship with China which is based on appropriate candour at times. So if we disagree, as we do over the new security law in Hong Kong, we'll say so. But it's also the case that China is a significant player in the global economy. China is a partner with whom we have to engage if we're going to make progress on dealing with climate change. So I think the right thing to do is to leave the leadership on diplomacy to the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary to do a great job, and for those decisions on other matters to be taken appropriately.
It's a delicate dance. Michael Gove, thank you very much indeed for talking to us today. That's all from me. Thanks to all my guests and to you for watching, of course, and until next week, goodbye.